The world's most famous tragic romance isn't a French fairy tale. It's a heavily sanitized case of geopolitical identity theft. For centuries, we've been handed a polished, chivalric Sir Tristan of Cornwall sweeping a princess off her feet in an elite, courtly love affair. But the dirt and stone carry a completely different signature. Underneath the medieval PR lies a raw, pragmatic, Pictish warlord named Drust, fighting for survival in the hyperviolent borderlands of the Old North.
Right.
Welcome back to the Hidden Roundtable podcast. Pull up a chair, pour a drink, and get comfortable because you are officially trekking with us into episode 8. If you've been with us for the last 7 episodes, you know we love peeling back the layers of history to find where the myths actually bleed into our modern reality. And if you're new here, you picked the perfect time to join the circle.
You really did.
Tonight, we are dismantling the southwestern romance of Tristan and Isolt. We're stripping away the French courtly nonsense, exposing the weaponized folklore of the Anglo-Norman elite, and tracking the forensic footprints of a 6th century northern warrior. Let's unearth the truth.
I have been waiting for this specific investigation for weeks. Because, we've spent hours at this table, pulling back the curtain on the whole Arthurian world, right?
Yeah.
King Arthur Kay, the whole brutal theater of the Old North.
The real Johanna Gold.
Exactly. But the Tristan story, this is where the cultural theft becomes just, it's truly systemic. It is the absolute masterpiece of medieval historical erasure.
It's weaponized folklore. And let's just unpack this right at the foundation. Because before we can start tracking where a story moved on a map or, why some elite group of people decided to steal it, we have to prove who the person actually was.
We need the receipts.
Right. We need the receipts. And to get them, we're going straight to the unalterable mathematics of language. We're looking at onomastic.
The study of names.
Yeah.
Which is, it's the linguistic trace evidence. Because when you strip away all that flowery romance poetry, the physical receipts do not point to a southern knight.
So I want you, the listener, to imagine tracking Tristan's name like you're examining a stolen vehicle. The thieves took this, rugged off-road northern machine, right? They shipped it down south, gave it a shiny new French paint job, swapped out the interior, and then they tried to just aggressively file off the serial numbers so nobody would recognize it.
But they messed up.
They made a massive mistake. They left the structural chassis perfectly intact because in these ancient oral traditions, names aren't empty labels. You can't just peel a sticky note off a character and slap a new one on.
No, the names are mnemonic pegs. They hold the entire structural skeleton of the story together.
Exactly. When a bard says a specific name around the fire, the audience instantly unlocks the archetypal behaviors, the alliances, all the historical trauma attached to that figure. So what is the original serial number on this vehicle?
If we scrape past the French chivalry and the whole southwestern Cornish branding, we hit an Iron Age Pictish fruit. The physical evidence demands we look at the name Drust, or its close variant Drust.
Okay, so let's pause there and make sure we're all visualizing the exact same map. When we say Pictish, we are talking about the sovereign confederations operating north of the Firth of Forth, early medieval Scotland. And I'm asking this for anyone who maybe just pictures guys in face paint screaming in the woods. What is a Pictist, really?
Yeah, they get treated like mythological boogeymen a lot, which is a massive disservice. The Picts were this highly organized, incredibly formidable Iron Age society. I mean, the Romans called them Picti, which basically just meant the painted people, probably because of their tattoos or woad.
But they didn't call themselves that.
No, not at all. They were a complex network of tribes who managed to do something almost impossible. They completely halted the northern expansion of the Roman Empire.
Which is no small feat.
It's massive. They built these huge hill forts, carved these incredibly enigmatic symbols into standing stones all over the Scottish landscape. And, this is key, they operated on a matrilineal succession system.
Oh, right. So the right to rule passed through the mother's bloodline.
Exactly. Not the father's. So they're this deeply entrenched sovereign power. And the name Drust isn't just some random background character name floating around. It is a heavy, elite, royal identifier in the Pictish regnal lists.
Like King Drust, Filius Tellerson in the 8th century.
Yes, exactly. And the name doesn't just exist on, fragile parchment that someone could have faked later. It is literally carved into the rock. We have the regional diminutive form of the name Drystan.
Wait, diminutive? Like how Bobby is short for Robert?
Precisely. Drystan is basically Little Drust, a term of endearment or regional variation. And we can point straight to the 9th century St. Vigin's stone in Angus. It's a physical monument that clearly records the genitive form Drystan, sitting right next to other totally northern names.
So the linguistic genesis of the character is firmly locked into the dirt and stone of Pictland.
100%.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here. You're telling me a Pictish king named Drust is the exact same guy as the French romantic knight Tristan, purely because their names sound kind of similar. I mean, isn't that a huge leap? People have similar names all over the world.
It's a totally valid skepticism to have. But we aren't relying on things just sounding similar. We are relying on unbreakable phonological laws. It's basically math.
Walk us through the math.
So imagine this Pictish name, this onomastic kernel of Drust, migrating south. The bards are carrying the story into the Brythonic-speaking zones of Cumbria and early Wales. As it travels, it has to adapt to the physiological rules of the local language. When the ancestral form, something like Drustanos, passes into early Welsh, it hits a linguistic mechanism called regressive eye affection.
Okay, hold on. ELI5 for us. Explain it like I'm 5. What is regressive eye affection, and what is physically happening inside the mouths of these storytellers?
Right, think of it as a domino effect of sound driven by pure vocal laziness.
Efficiency.
Exactly, efficiency. In Drustanos, you eventually get a high front vowel, like an E or a Y sound, sitting at the very end of the word as the language evolves. Now, when early Welsh speakers said this, their mouths subconsciously anticipated that high vowel at the end.
Because your mouth wants to get to the finish line as fast as possible.
Exactly. So that subconscious anticipation forces the back vowel in the root, that deep oo sound in Drust, to migrate forward in the mouth before it's supposed to. The oo mutates into an E or I sound.
Your mouth gets ready for the end of the word before it even finishes the beginning.
And this isn't just a theory, it's a strict phonological law in Brythonic languages. That mutation mathematically yields the Old Welsh form Drystan.
Okay, so Drust undeniably evolves into Drystan through just the mechanics of human speech.
It's a direct one-to-one evolutionary chain.
But Drystan still sounds like a gritty, mud-covered warrior. It does not sound like the weeping French knight. Which brings us to the Norman phonetic hijack.
The year 1066.
Right. Everything changes. The Norman conquest brings a completely new set of linguistic overlords to the island. And when these post-conquest Anglo-Norman romancers encounter the Welsh name Drystan, their mouths literally rebel against it. They force a dental plosive shift.
Right, they just couldn't handle the Welsh articulation.
Break down dental plosive shift for us.
A dental plosive is when you stop the airflow by pressing your tongue against your teeth, your dental ridge, and then release it with a burst of air, a hard TUD sound. The Anglo-Norman speakers struggled with that specific Welsh D and R cluster in Drystan, so they just forcibly swapped the voiced D to a voiceless T because it fit Romance phonetics better.
It was just easier for them to say Kristen.
Exactly.
But changing a D to a T is only half the crime here. The truly insane part of this identity theft is the paratymological reassignment.
Yes.
Which sounds like a clinical corporate legal term.
Because it is basically an aggressive corporate rebranding based on a false etymology.
Explain how that worked.
Well, the French scribes noticed that this newly altered name, Tristan, sounded suspiciously like the Latin word tristis and the Old French word triste, both of which mean sad or sorrowful.
Which is absolutely wild. That's like, okay, imagine a modern movie studio buys the rights to a gritty street-level superhero, right? And they notice a typo on the toy box makes his name sound like a brand of vacuum cleaner.
Oh my God.
And they just decide, well, I guess he fights crime using household appliances now. They fundamentally rewrite his entire origin story based on a spelling error.
It's a perfect analogy. They didn't just change the pronunciation, they retroactively engineered his entire backstory to justify the typo. The name went from signaling an indomitable Pictish warlord to being a literal prophecy of misery.
The historical weight is completely gutted.
Utterly gutted.
Mm.
I mean, look at Gottfried von Strasberg's epic romance from 1210. He writes this huge sweeping scene where the hero's mother is dying in childbirth right after hearing her husband died in battle. And she literally looks at the baby and names him Tristan, specifically because of the sorrowful circumstances of his birth.
Wow.
Strasberg writes a multi-thousand-line tragedy just to explain a phonetic shift. The Pictish reality is buried under a mountain of French melodrama.
It's the ultimate linguistic identity theft.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Once the scribes stole and modified the name, they backed themselves into a corner.
Geography.
Geography. They logically had to steal his geography to make the illusions stick. because you can't have a polished, chivalric southern knight operating out of a sovereign northern Scottish kingdom that the southern elite actively despise.
You cannot rewrite a man without rewriting the ground he stands on.
Exactly. And this leads us to the Lyonesse and Lothian shift, the cartographic gerrymandering. And I really want you to think about this process. How does a supposedly advanced, heavily documented medieval society just misplace an entire kingdom?
It wasn't an accident.
No, it was a deliberate, calculated assassination of a map. To understand the scale of it, we have to anchor Drust's original geography in reality. Where was he actually operating?
In the earliest layers of the northern tradition, the base of operations is the Celtic kingdom of Lothian.
Down in southeast Scotland.
Right. In Welsh, it was known as Lydnion, and in Latin records, it's designated as Lutenesia. This is the absolute tactical heart of the Gododin power block. It is a rugged, volcanic, unforgiving landscape, freezing coastal winds, massive basalt rocks, heavy hill forts like Trapbrain Law.
Definitely not a place for playing lutes and silk tunics.
Not at all.
So how does Lutenesia in Scotland become the mythical, shimmering southern kingdom of Lyonesse? How do you physically execute a geographical shift like that before the printing press?
It all comes down to the mechanics of medieval translation. You have to visualize how information moved back then. Picture a freezing stone room in a French abbey. A scribe is sitting at a desk, copying a manuscript by candlelight. He's looking at an insular Celtic account that has traveled hundreds of miles.
And he has no idea what he's looking at.
Exactly. These continental writers were completely ignorant of British internal geography. They'd never seen Scotland. So when they translated these Latin accounts into Old French, they rendered Lutenesia as Lyonesse or Lyonesse.
Okay, so phonetic drift again. Lutenesia to Leonore. But how does a spelling change move a country?
Telephone game. Scribes in the south of England or over in Brittany had no idea what a Lyonnois was. It was a remote topogram that meant absolutely nothing to them. So human nature takes over, and they start conflating it with places they actually know. Some confuse it with the Principality of Lyon in Brittany. Others just decided to drop it right next to Cornwall on the map because, well, it fit the narrative flow better.
They are literally pinning the tail on the donkey with an entire landmass.
Pretty much.
They move a Scottish powerhouse hundreds of miles south just for storytelling convenience.
But that compounding error creates a huge logistical nightmare for them later. Once the story gets super popular among the elite, people start looking at actual maps of Cornwall for taxation and land grants, and they go, wait a second, there is no Kingdom of Lyonesse here.
Right, you can't invent a neighboring country and expect the tax collectors not to notice.
Exactly. Which forces the Romance tradition to invent the ultimate cover-up, the sunken kingdom alibi.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the grift.
To rationalize why this legendary realm wasn't on any physical map, writers aggressively grafted on localized flooding myths from the southwest. They manufactured this whole maritime fantasy. They claimed that Lyonnois, now corrupted into Lyonesse, was this rich, low-lying peninsula stretching from Land's End all the way out to the Isles of Scilly.
And supposedly packed with, what, 140 churches?
Yes. Magnificent cities, all swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean in a single catastrophic night.
It is brilliant in its sheer audacity. If someone asks to see the hero's homeland, you just point at the ocean and say, oh, it sank.
You can't verify it. You can't visit it. And most importantly, you can't prove it didn't exist.
It's the perfect crime. There's no crime scene left to investigate. But the result is devastating. It permanently severs Drust from his raw, subboreal reality. He trades a volcanic Scottish stronghold for a drowned fairy tale.
And that brings up a really crucial point. How did they get away with this? How does a massive campaign of textual gerrymandering succeed without the actual people of the North screaming, hey, that's our history?
Right. Why wasn't there a northern counter-narrative pushing back? Which takes us into the brutal geopolitical reality of the 9th to 11th centuries. We really have to talk about survivor bias and the meat grinder.
Yeah.
Because it's like a hostile corporate takeover.
Yeah.
The new board buys the company, shreds all the old files, fires the original staff, and then rewrites the founding charter to make themselves look like the inventors of the product.
That is exactly what happened. If you want to understand the silence of the North, you have to look at the total obliteration of the Old North. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, kingdoms like Gododin, Reged, Strathclyde, they were fed into a wood chipper.
The meat grinder of history.
Relentless Viking onslaught striking the coasts. You have the expansion of Alba pushing down from the highlands, subsuming Pictish identities, and the English kingdoms pushing up from the south. The sovereign polities of the Old North were just wiped off the map. Their oral courts were disbanded. Their ecclesiastical centers where the manuscripts were kept were burned to the ground.
The physical vellum was turned to ash.
So there is literally nobody left with the power or the platform to defend the original narrative.
The original shareholders are gone, which creates this profound survivor bias. We only have the stories told by the people who didn't burn in the fires.
Look at who actually survived with their power intact. The 12th century Anglo-Norman courts.
The conquerors.
Exactly. You have these foreign rulers with massive material wealth, organized scriptoriums, and stacks of pristine vellum. Writers like Beroul and Thomas of Britain are operating under immense royal patronage. And they essentially colonized northern history.
But why? Why did the Normans care about stealing a Scottish story?
Because kings like Henry II of the Angevin Empire faced a severe crisis of legitimacy. They were foreign conquerors ruling a hostile Anglo-Saxon majority while trying to manage France and suppress Wales. To bypass the Anglo-Saxon narrative that painted them as invaders, they systematically co-opted the mythology of the Celtic Britons. They collected the surviving stories, scrubbed them clean, and relocated the exploits to Cornwall and Brittany territories they directly controlled.
So it's propaganda. They manufacture this ancient British pedigree to validate their own empire. They're telling their subjects, we aren't foreign invaders. We are the rightful heirs to the ancient empire of Arthur and Tristan.
Yes. And they neutralized the sovereignty of the North in the process. Because the original poetry of the Old North was dangerous. It celebrated savage resistance against foreign invaders. By turning those resistance fighters into polite, courtly lovers agonizing over affairs, they defanged the history of Northern rebellion.
They turn a tactical threat into drawing room entertainment.
Exactly.
But the beauty of a forensic investigation is that you can never burn all the receipts. The soil remembers. The name remains stubbornly anchored in the North, totally ignoring the French PR campaign. Let's look at the Midlothian receipt.
Right, the epigraphical evidence at the foot of the Pentland Hills. The absolute anchor for our northern theory lies in the historical barony of Creighton.
What are we actually looking at there?
Official land grants. Specifically, the 1128 foundation charter of the Abbacy of Holyrood House, granted by King David I. On this official state document, acting as a prominent witness, is a high-status nobleman named Tristan de Crechtun, sometimes written as Thurstanus de Crechtun.
Okay, let's trace that linguistic chain again. Drust, Drystan, Tristan, Turstan.
Exactly. You have a high-status individual bearing that specific onomastic signature in 12th century Lothian. It proves the name complex remained actively associated with elite land tenure in the north. The name never left, it just evolved locally while the scribes down south were busy inventing a sunken kingdom.
And when you look at the terrain of the Creighton and Pentland Hills region, it all clicks. The Pentland frontier, which historically derives from Petland, meaning the land of the Picts, was a highly militarized meat grinder.
In the 6th and 7th centuries, this was the violent intersection of three major military powers: the Brythonic Kingdom of Gododin, the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria pushing up, and the sovereign Pictish confederations operating just north.
The ultimate collision zone.
It was defined by cross-border cattle raiding, intense diplomacy, and heavy mercenary exchange. It is the exact crucible required to forge heroic poetry. A warrior bearing the Pictish name Drust, operating as a mercenary in Gododin, would have his exploits celebrated in the local dialects. The fluid geography allowed his legend to cross ethnic lines long before the southern courts got their hands on it.
Okay, but I know exactly what the counter-argument is going to be. If I go to Cornwall right now, the local historians and the tourism boards are going to point to a physical object. They have a trump card they use to justify their ownership of the legend, the Tristan Stone.
Ah, the Tristan Stone.
Yeah.
The 6th century monument sitting near Foley and Castle Door. For decades, this has been held up as definitive physical proof that the legend is Southern.
They say, look, we literally have his grave right here, so let's bring out the scalpels. We need to do a forensic autopsy on this stone. What are we actually looking at?
We're looking at a 2.7-meter tall granite pillar, paleographically dated to the mid-6th century. And the reason it's so fiercely defended is the downward-running Latin inscription on its face,
which translates to, Dristanus lies here, the son of Cunomoris.
Yes, and Southern origin theorists use this to claim absolute victory. They say, look, here is a 6th century Tristanus buried in Cornwall, and he's the son of Cunomoris, a historical ruler who the 9th century monk Romanik explicitly equated with King Mark. Case closed, right? Tristan and King Mark in the dirt.
But when you actually apply critical pressure to that inscription, the whole foundation just crumbles. Let's start with the kinship paradox.
It is the fatal flaw. Read the stone again.
Yeah.
It claims Dristanus is the Filius, the son of Cunimorus, but the entire structural tension of the medieval romance, the absolute core of the narrative, depends on Tristan being the nephew of King Mark, specifically the sister son.
Right, and in early Celtic and Germanic societies, the bond between a maternal uncle and his nephew was incredibly sacred, usually closer than father and son. The tragedy relies on the fact that Tristan owes this agonizing, conflicting loyalty to his uncle. It's a highly specific cultural dynamic. If they are father and son, the romance completely collapses.
It changes the entire psychological profile of the story.
Exactly. You're no longer reading a tragic tale of torn allegiances. You're reading a completely different, much darker story of stepmother-son incest. The structural architecture of the myth absolutely does not match the monument.
And that's just the narrative contradiction. The physical reading of the stone itself is compromised by massive paleographic instability. We have to remember this is heavily weathered, damaged granite sitting in the elements for over 1,000 years. Identifying the first name as Dristanus is a relatively modern scholarly intervention.
Let's walk through that timeline because I think people assume it's always said Dristanus.
Far from it. In 1586, the great antiquarian William Camden transcribed the stone. He did not read Dristanus. He read CRVVs. And that reading was maintained by respected scholars for centuries, like Edward Llewellyn in 1700 and William Borlase in 1754.
So for hundreds of years, the best minds looking at this rock saw Servius, which sounds nothing like Tristan.
It wasn't until 1875 that the Welsh scholar John Rhys examined the stone. Rhys applied a highly creative paleographic reading to the degraded letters. He retroactively forced the Dristanus reading onto the stone, specifically to make it fit the prevailing literary myth.
He found exactly what he wanted to find, textbook confirmation bias, and it perfectly fed into the massive Victorian rebranding effort happening at the time.
The Victorian Arthurian revival was this immense economic engine, driven by Alfred Lord Tennyson's poetry. Local landowners were desperate to anchor these floating myths into the physical landscape to generate romantic tourism. They literally packaged the monument for public consumption.
And it goes all the way to the top levels of mapping. In 1951, the British Ordnance Survey officially stepped in. They took a monument that had been known locally for centuries simply as the Long Stone, and they officially renamed it the Tristan Stone on state maps. It is aggressive cartographic labeling to manufacture a tourist trap.
But the final blow to the Cornwall theory doesn't come from 19th century records. It comes from an antiquarian named John Leland in 1542, and the modern application of high technology to completely debunk him.
This is where it gets incredibly high-tech, and I love this. Set the stage with Leland.
In 1542, Leland, acting as antiquary to King Henry VIII, inspected the stone when it was in much better shape. He claimed he saw a third line of text beneath the main inscription. He recorded it as reading CVM Domina Usilla, meaning with the Lady Isolt.
Oh, wow. Okay, if that's true, if Tristan and Isolt are buried together under the same stone in Cornwall, that destroys the tragic ending where they are separated in death. But it would be the holy grail for Southern theorists.
Exactly. For centuries, scholars debated this lost third line, hoping it was real. But recently, researchers decided to stop guessing and actually look at the microtopography of the granite. The monument was subjected to a Faro laser scan.
Explain how a Faro scan works, because it's not just a fancy photograph.
No, it's time-of-flight laser measurement. The scanner fires millions of laser pulses at the rock per second. It measures the exact time it takes for each photon to bounce off the surface and return. By doing this, it maps the distance and surface depth down to the micromillimeter. It creates a perfect 3D topographical map, entirely ignoring shadows, moss, or optical illusions.
It's pure physics. The rock can't hide its shape from a laser, so what did the data actually show?
The Faro scan utterly shattered Leland's claim. The laser data proves unequivocally that there was never a third line of text carved into that section of the stone.
None at all.
Zero. The microfissures and tooling marks required for a Latin inscription simply do not exist in the granite. They never did. Leland's CVM Domina Usilla was a total myth.
A ghost line.
A complete fabrication. The data exposes the monument for exactly what it is, a contested sub-Roman marker retroactively repurposed and branded to fuel Victorian tourist marketing. It is not the anchor of the Tristan legend. It is a prop. If you're tracking with us into the dirt of this investigation, pull up a permanent chair at the table, lock us in on your feed, and drop a rating.
Seriously, it keeps the lights on and the shovel digging. Every bit of engagement helps us keep pushing back against centuries of weaponized folklore.
Let's keep this train rolling. take us right into the textual gerrymandering of the original Celtic archetypes, because the Romance writers did a massive number on the raw aced flight into the Caledonian forest.
Exactly, because if the stone is debunked and Lyonesse is a proven fabrication, we have to strip away the remaining French courtly veneer. We are left staring at the raw, archaic marrow of the story. And it is not polite. We have to completely throw out the concept of courtly love.
Oh, absolutely.
The French writers gave us this stylized romantic isolation, right? Tristan and Isolt hiding in a charming little forest cabin, playing music, eating fresh fruit. It's absolute nonsense. When you scrape it back, you don't find a woodland retreat, you find an aithed.
The Aithed is a highly specific, ancient Celtic literary genre. It translates roughly to a wild, illicit elopement. But elopement sounds way too polite for what it actually is. It's a desperate, survivalist flight into the wilderness. It is fraught with extreme physical deprivation, exposure, and the constant threat of lethal violence from the sovereign you just betrayed.
It's a harsh, brutal exile. Let's really picture the Caledonian forest in the 6th century. It is damp, freezing, teeming with wolves. They are sleeping on the freezing ground, hunting wild game to avoid starvation, constantly looking over their shoulders for a war band coming to execute them.
Yeah, it's survival.
And we know this structure because it matches perfectly with other deeply embedded northern myths. Look at the Ulster cycle tale of Deirdre and Lyonesse, or the Fenian saga of Diarmuid and Grain. It's the exact same architecture. A young warrior flees into the brutal wilderness with the young wife of his aging chief, inviting the absolute wrath of the tribe.
The structural parallels are impossible to ignore. But this brings up a counter-argument we have to address, because some scholars still refuse to let go of the South. There's a faction that proposes a name-only myth.
What are they arguing?
They argue that, fine, the name Tristan migrated from the Pictish north down to Cornwall. They concede the linguistic math. But they claim the narrative itself was invented completely independently in the South. They suggest the Cornish writers just borrowed a cool-sounding northern name to pin onto their own local creation.
Which goes right back to the stolen car analogy. You can't just peel the sticky note off a character without bringing the baggage.
Exactly. I push back against this theory entirely. Characters in early medieval societies do not travel as empty linguistic tags. The names are structural anchors. And we have the receipts to prove the whole relational network traveled together long before the French got involved. Look, the Welsh triads, the triad Ennis Prydain.
The early memory devices used by Welsh bards, they grouped information into threes to help memorize complex story elements without writing them down.
Yes, and the triads explicitly and permanently lock the character Drystan mab Calwach, the direct Welsh reflex of Drust, son of Tolerson, together with Isolt and March ap Miriam.
Tristan, Isolt, and King Mark.
Packaged together fundamentally. The systemic preservation of this triadic relationship proves the narrative framework traveled as a complete, unbreakable unit. A supposedly independent Cornish romance wouldn't utilize a highly specific, paired set of Northern royal names.
Because they didn't invent it. They just changed the ZIP code. And once you realize you're looking at ancient Northern architecture, all the supposedly chivalric elements start to decode into something much darker, like the chivalric jousts.
Specifically, the encounter with the giant Morholt.
Right. In the French version, Morholt arrives in Cornwall as an Irish knight demanding a tribute of youths. Tristan steps up, they have a formal heraldic engagement, and Tristan wins. But what is actually happening underneath that scene?
You're looking at a direct literary callback to archaic mythological conflicts with the Fomor.
The Fomorians, who are they?
In deep Celtic myth, the Fomor are submarine, monstrous demons who demand horrific human tribute from the coastal inhabitants. They are chaotic, otherworld forces of nature. Morholt isn't a knight. He's a manifestation of this ancient maritime threat coming from the sea to steal the youth of the tribe.
And the way Tristan actually fights him abandons medieval jousting rules completely. They fight alone on a deserted island.
Which exposes the combat as an ancient comrac single, a judicial single combat, deeply embedded in early Irish and Northern law. It's raw existential violence designed to protect coastal territory from a supernatural threat. There are no heralds or pavilions. It's a brutal fight to the death on a rock in the ocean.
And we find this exact blueprint anchored squarely in the Northern Islands. The 10th century Irish tale, the Tochmarc Emire.
The wooing of Ea.
Exactly. In this story, the great hero Cuchulainn travels to the Hebrides in Scotland. While there, he meets a warrior whose name is literally Drust. And what does this Drust do? He fights a sea monster demanding a human tribute in the form of a royal princess. He slays the beast, rescues the girl, and entirely refuses to accept her as a reward.
It is the exact structural architecture of the Tristan story, played out in the Hebrides, utilizing the exact same name. It proves the narrative marrow is intrinsically tied to the Northern Maritime Theater.
Not the Angevin Empire. And there's one more bizarre detail we have to decode because it proves we are dealing with archaic tribal memory. The secret of King Mark.
The myth of the king's ears.
Yes. In the older layers of the tradition, there is this weird motif that King Mark secretly has the ears of a horse. He hides it under his crown and it's treated like a silly fairy tale, but it's not, is it?
Not at all. It is a linguistic fossil. In the Brythonic languages, the word march literally translates to horse.
The king's name is literally horse.
Precisely. And this points directly back to archaic systems of zoomorphic kingship and totemic tribal identities. Rulers were tied to totemic animals to legitimize their connection to the land. The horse's ears aren't a quirky physical deformity. They are a degraded memory of an ancient Brythonic chieftain whose very title was bound up in the totem of the horse.
When you lay it all out like this, the scale of the theft is breathtaking. Let's pull this all together for you. Let's look at the 4 distinct stages of evolution.
The synthesis of the investigation.
Right. Stage 1. The Pictish seed. 6th to 8th centuries. We have a historical northern warlord, Drust, operating out of the Lothian frontier, fighting off maritime threats, enduring a brutal 8th through the freezing forests.
Stage 2. The Brythonic meme. 8th to 11th centuries. The narrative migrates south. It's so dominant that southern chiefs start adopting the name for their own sons, which is how you get a 6th century prince named Drystan buried in Cornwall.
Stage 3. The geographical corruption. 11th and 12th centuries. The north is burned to the ground. Continental writers stumble over the translation of Lothian Lyonesse and entirely misinterpret it, inventing the sunken land of Lyonesse to explain their ignorance.
And finally, stage 4, chivalric overwriting. 12th to 15th centuries. The Anglo-Norman propaganda machine shifts into high gear, mapping the entire story onto their own southern territories to establish legitimacy, stripping away the wild Pictish champion and encasing him in French courtly love.
The wild northern warrior is permanently overwritten into a tragic, sighing knight. It's the perfect murder of a historical identity.
Which leaves us with a deeply unsettling question. If an entire empire, utilizing immense wealth and scribal power, could so cleanly overwrite a historical Pictish warlord into a French romantic knight by simply weaponizing a few syllables and manipulating a map, what other towering historical figures on our modern maps are just ghosts wearing stolen armor?
That is exactly why we do this. Thank you for staying at the table with us. Tracking through the dirt, the stone, the laser scans, and the linguistic math of this investigation takes effort. It is dense, it is heavy, but is the only way we get to the truth.
Next time we hit the shield wall at a definitive battle site, keep digging.